It's 2 o'clock. People are, of course, still coming, but maybe we can start with a short overview already. Yeah, well, thanks everyone for joining this first parallel session, and we have all our 5 speakers here of this this interesting session, which I think links very well to the general topics discussed in the plenary now a bit more in detail. So this session focuses on the Fit for 55 package for Europe, how to and what different ways and implications these policies can have for Europe. We have, as I said, 5 speakers looking at different types of policies, how it links to the growth and economic dimension, social implications, and then also in general, just looking what different policies and policy packages are can be possible, and how can this kind of, especially carbon neutrality by 2050, be achieved. So there's a small change in the program, as you will see, in the sense that Christopher and Benjamin swapped their presentations due to timing issues, but I hope that's not an issue. So yeah, I think we can maybe get ready for the first presentation. The idea was to have presentations to be limited at 12 minutes per participant to give room for everyone. And I will give you a 1 minute heads up before the time is up. And so we have 5 minutes for questions or by live interaction, or you can always write the question in the chat. And then we, at the very end, we have, depending on how it goes, a few minutes for a general discussion on this topic. Yeah, so with that being said, Benjamin Best from the Wuppertal Institute is the first one who will present on sufficiency policies. So let's see if now, Benjamin, you can share the screen. It should work. Yes, perfect. Excellent. Okay.
Cool. Many thanks, Johannes. Thanks for letting me present first, also to Christopher. Yeah, as we know, pathway towards climate neutrality also includes lifestyle changes, and this is underlined also by studies of the IEA and the IPCC in the recent years. And I focus on sufficiency. Sufficiency or the person kilometer traveled. And this has been ignored for many years, but is now back on the agenda. And I would like to present you the idea and early stages of of the construction of a database for sufficiency policies. There are already many climate and energy policy databases, but none for sufficiency policy. And just like clever support for energy efficiency or also renewable energy technologies, a reduction of energy service demand also needs clever policies. Yeah, energy sufficiency is now gaining momentum, but what do I mean by energy sufficiency? In my understanding, it's the absolute reduction of energy demand by reduction of energy service demand. To put this in a really simple equation, the GHG emissions are a product of the amount of goods and services consumed multiplied by the energy demand used for these products and services, multiplied by the GHG intensity of the energy generation minus negative emissions. And strategies there are negative emission technologies, renewables, and efficiency, which by and large are technical solutions. And sufficiency, we think, is not a technical solution, but rather induced by societal change. Here it becomes really obvious that the level of consumption of services and products, and thus the energy service demand, is one of the decisive factors in this equation. But in hardly any of the scenarios, different indicators and units for energy service demand are even mentioned. So it is not about person kilometer traveled, but the type of engine that is used for transport demand. We have looked at several studies modeling climate neutrality or almost climate neutrality in Germany, and just very few mention or explicitly model service demand. Each dot here represents one scenario, and the colors indicate the respective authors or initiators of the studies. In all of these scenarios, the final energy demand decreases in comparison to 2018, which is the red dot here, as you can see. But mostly these are efficiency gains. There are two studies which explicitly mention sufficiency. However, one of those, the scenario is explicitly called sufficiency, and it assumes final energy demand, but it does not go into detail how it is reached and why. We just found really one study which explicitly and thoroughly examines the potential of sufficiency in all its different aspects and in all sectors, including interactions. And this was done by the Federal Agency for Environment, UBA, in Germany. And it not only optimizes costs while reaching climate goals, but also while reducing the resource use. So the takeaway here is that the final energy demand is really a key and can be found in many scenarios, but it's mainly reached due to efficiency. And this is why we think we need a sufficiency policy database. If we assume that the energy service demand is so important, how do we advise policymakers or other decision makers from NGOs, etc., to reach it? We think it would be really dangerous to just model sufficiency as an individual lifestyle change out of the blue, because such assumptions need to be backed up with concrete policy options. My colleague, Johannes Thema from the Wuppertal Institute, is talking right now about the methodology, how to implement policies in transport modeling in a session parallel to this one. Maybe you are interested in rewatching it after the recording was uploaded. So this is how we proceed with the extraction of policy measures. The database are many different sources. We include scenario studies, project reports, policy plans, etc., with the scope of the European Union and national countries. We discuss policy ideas also with our stakeholders, and we are not done with this project yet. So we are still extracting measures out of these studies. And the categories of our database are different sectors and different policy levels and policy goals. The policy goals can also be used to group different measures that aim, for example, for a reduction of square meters or livestock. And then we also extract respective indicators which can be used for modeling. We differentiate between three different sufficiency types. The first one is called reduction. These are measures that reduce utility levels. The second is called substitutions. These measures aim at the reduction of energy-intensive services and replace them with less energy-intensive services. A classic example would be mode shift in transport. And thirdly are general measures that change the overall regulatory or incentive framework to promote energy savings. Whenever we find anything, we also include quantified effects, for example, emission reduction potential and good practice examples, but these informations are rare. We differentiate between 9 different instrument types, and we follow their established definition of the UNFCCC. And these are the instrument types we identify. Economic and fiscal instruments are monetary and market instruments of all kinds. Regulation can include laws, but also bans. Information and education include campaigns and also curricula in schools. This is a category for all other instruments that cannot be subsumed in any of the other categories and not specified as a category where no specific instrument can be derived. And we think a policy mix is needed for sufficiency, because a price on CO2 or resource use alone does not build bike lanes or launch awareness campaigns. It would be interesting for me to see how you could utilize different policy instruments in your work. Here you can see an example of sufficiency measures, vegetarian diets, growth independence and promotion of teleworking, and there are quantified effects for these measures as well. Our database will be open access, but it's just a spreadsheet right now, and it would be interesting to hear from you which design you could use best to access a database. Our database right now includes 240 measures almost, but most of them in the transport sector, and we are still in the process of extracting measures. And we will also need to prioritize measures, for example, for recommendation. And this would be a form to visualize our work. We already extracted all sufficiency measures in the European National Energy and Climate Plans, the NECPs, and the long-term strategies, LTS. And the size of the bubble here indicates the number of the measures we found in the different sectors. And there are many different instrument types used in all sectors, as you can see. Only the bold parts of the bubbles here are reduction type measures. The others are substitution or general measures. You can also look at our publication here and examine which sufficiency measures are planned in your country until 2050. Yeah, if we have time, I would like to discuss, could a database of sufficiency policies be of any use for you? What would it need to contain, and which form should we publish it? Is it Excel type, Wikipedia, or graphical user interface? What would be a good way to approach a sufficiency policy database? I hope I stuck in my time, stick to my time.
Yes. You even have 2 minutes left, but perfect. I mean, it's
Nice.
great to be in time. Thanks a lot, Ben. Great. Okay. And thanks for already putting up maybe the discussion. I mean, you can still leave it up there. The questions, maybe. I think it's most useful, of course, if you have already some questions. So yeah, thanks for taking the time and for this interesting topic. So let's maybe first see if there are any direct questions or reactions from the crowd, from the other speakers. Thank you. Yeah, so you can raise your hand, or you can also directly intervene. I think it's also doable in our parallel sessions. Okay, so any other panelist or participant having particular questions or if not, I might start with one. Thanks. I mean, I think that's really interesting. We've been working indeed with some of these policy databases, so that's very interesting to see. So I have one question. Is like, I mean, can you maybe give an example of like the most let's say if you go back to the slide, I think transportation you meant. I mean, which are the key policies that and how which are, because I think there's some overlap also with other kind policy databases. So I wonder how much of these policies would already be covered by other databases there. Do you know that? That was one question I had.
Okay. Yeah, we are still in the process of extracting the policies and the quantification. So it's really hard to say which are the key policies, because we need to have quantified effects then to say which are the most important, the big points. But we are now at the moment trying to gather all the policies we think are really important. And for transport, we think it's really important to have incentives to reduce the number of trips and also to reduce the number of short trips by car, for example. And also we are discussing which policy level would be best for this to do. Right at the moment, in Germany, we are looking on the national level a lot because we have a new government coming up. But I think that policies for transport are most interesting for city level because the city has really strong possibilities to steer transport and measures there.
I see.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, makes sense. Okay. Christopher, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I had a similar question if we still have time. Just curious, if, sort of in a similar way, if there's been a thought about how to rank the policies according to their impactfulness on one hand, but also their disruptiveness on the other, because it seems like you're trying to find these high impact policies that won't destroy people's lives, and that's kind of, I could see that being both useful from a modeling perspective of being able to put the policies into models to determine some of those things, but then also once you've done that, then to be able to feed that back into models as an input. So I guess that's a common question. But...
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Johannes has already done this for the transport measures, and he prioritized the impact and also the readiness for recommendation, and also the possibility to implement the policy in different national contexts, because a policy that is useful for, say, Estland is maybe not good for France. So these are methodologies that have been used in transport studies already, and he adapted this for his work. And if we don't have really numbers for the impact, maybe it's also interesting to have an expert guess on the transformative potential of policies, their contribution to systemic change.
Any other questions or also comments? I think also the idea of having that data available for, let's say, modelers might be interesting. I had the question there, but I don't know if any other has comments or questions. Please just speak up. I have one question, which is about, so from our experience of implementing policies. I mean, typically, especially when acting on not on this more, let's say, soft factors, it's quite easy. So let's say an emission, or let's say a renewable mandate or something. It's quite easy to implement, right, in a model where you have energy system. I mean, it's just you put some bounds on certain technologies. How I wonder, yeah, what format would be most useful for these kind of policies, given that they are not, let's say, especially in energy system models, to be added, given that they act on the demand, but also only on parts of the demand, for instance, city transport. So, yeah, I mean, maybe it would be. I think it would be really great to have to see how it looks at the moment. Maybe you can share it later on, or a link or something. The sheet that you have, how detailed it is. So how we can, for instance, you can use it in a country level. Energy system model which has energy demand, but then energy demand can be affected by, or service demand by this. So yeah, that would be great to see. I think that, yeah, it can be really useful, but I see, yeah, a step is still needed to make the data accessible.
Yeah. The French organization Negawatt is also working on a similar topic, and they identified many sufficiency indicators for a sufficiency scenario project for Europe, and they have a huge dashboard where sufficiency impacts many different indicators in the different sectors. So I think this is they made a huge step forward already.
Right. Interesting. Great. Okay. Thanks. I think, yeah, we have, for the sake of time, we have to move on. Thanks a lot, Ben, and we still have some time to maybe final questions if in case you come up during this whole session. So let's move on to Christopher, who just spoke, who is going to give the next talk on the role of growth, and especially investments in energy system models. So Christopher, the floor is yours. I can see your presentation. Thanks.
Perfect, thank you. And thank you to Ben for his presentation, because I think the organizers did a great job putting us together, because as he's talking about reducing demand, I'm talking about sort of the possibility of increasing demand and what that might mean for the overall economic system. So I'm Christopher Proctor, and I'm at University of Technology of Compiègne in France and Rome University. And yes, talking about preparing for green growth, incorporating investment-led growth effects into climate economy energy models. There. And so just briefly, the type of modeling or the class of modeling that I'm talking about here is integrated assessment modeling. Usually it takes a lot of work to explain what this is, but I imagine at this conference people are more or less familiar with it. So these are a type of modeling framework that tries to integrate a number of topics relevant to climate change. Typically, they always have at least economic, climate, and energy models that are combined together in some way, but they can be much, much bigger. And some of the models which were presented in the plenary session this morning were these very large integrated assessment models that have land and water and all kinds of different things, materials, technologies all fed in and mixed into them. And as an economist, these are very interesting models to play with, because they use economic data both as an input, as like a starting point to see how the world could develop, but also as an output to see what the transition will do to the rate of economic growth. And so I like to think of these types of models as a more of a form of science fiction than a lot of what we usually do in economics. So instead of trying to project something 6 months in the future, these models are really trying to tell a coherent story about the world's technical, social, economic, and environmental development up to 100 years in the future, which is quite ambitious, but it's the situation that we're in, that it's exactly what's necessary. And so within this task, there's sort of two different projects. The first is building the models, so really constructing the world in the science fiction metaphor here. How do things relate to each other? What are the rules of cause and effect? If the aliens show up, how do the people react to this? And that's kind of the work of actually building these models. But then there's an entire extra set of work of the scenario design. So what stories are we telling within these worlds that we've created? And what are the different possibilities that we can see that can happen in our worlds? And so as a very general task for us as energy, climate, economy modelers, we need to create more realistic worlds, but we also need to tell more relevant and more impactful stories. And so I think that's kind of the work of the next 30 years is making sure we're able to tell some of these stories. And there was a very nice paper that came out a week before Europe and North America started locking down for COVID in 2020 about the need for modeling extremes in energy and economic systems. And so I thought that it was quite nice timing right as a very extreme event was about to occur. This was McCollum and friends writing in Nature. But they sort of categorize that there's all these different types of events and things that can happen over the period of the energy transition and decarbonization. Some things would be transient events, so maybe something like COVID that knocks us off course for a while, but eventually we expect to return somewhat back to normal, or disruptive things that could possibly knock us off course entirely. But then finally, there's entirely unexpected outcomes that we really don't even know how to look for. And so again, as energy modelers, this is one of our tasks, is to try to slowly explore what could the world look like in these different scenarios, in these different situations. And so I refer you to the paper for some of their discussion on the specific things that we should be looking at. But it was quite interesting that they did not include a global pandemic in the different things to be looking out for. So just as a reminder that there's lots of things that we should be keeping in mind. But one that I think is quite interesting is the idea of green growth. So green growth is a phrase or a slogan that's very widely used to frame current decarbonization plans. So in Europe, we now have the European Green Deal. In the US, there's a lot of talk about a Green New Deal, which are very much framed as economic measures trying to drive economic prosperity, as well as decarbonization. And so it's sort of, that is the framing, and that's very much what at least the politicians and policymakers are going for. But it's an issue because in the vast majority of our integrated assessment modelers, it's impossible to have these kind of long-term growth effects that are predicted or at least expected in green growth discussions. So the vast majority of the integrated assessment models use general equilibrium modeling as the core model or module for the economic forecasts. And within these, long-term growth from decarbonization is impossible. And as my main argument is that this leaves our models unprepared for a world in which these huge new investments that we're discussing actually do drive sustained growth. So sort of, I guess, zoom back in or zoom in a little bit into these types of models and how they treat economic growth. So there's a number of different types of economic modeling that can be used for the core of any given integrated assessment modeling. As I said, general equilibrium modeling is the most common, and these are usually computable general equilibrium models, but also sometimes dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, or partial equilibrium models, in which one sector, usually the energy sector, is modeled extensively, but the rest of economy is assumed to just be in static equilibrium. There's also a handful of other types of modeling that have been used to make integrated assessment models that I'll briefly talk about here. So macroeconometric modeling, using large sets of macroeconomic coefficients to try to build a framework for what could happen. And then system dynamic modeling, which is similar idea but with algebraic equations, showing the different relations between different parts of the economy. And then finally, agent-based modeling, which is sort of a new and exciting field here that I actually don't talk a lot about now, but there's sort of things that are starting to come up. Recently, the Schumpeter meeting Keynes model has been extended to become a climate model. So that's kind of a thing to explore separately. But sort of the meat of the presentation and the real thing that we need to get around here is the way general equilibrium models treat growth. So within any given general equilibrium model, the model assumes that the economy starts in a state of optimized equilibrium and will constantly operate at full capacity throughout the entire model run. And so very specifically, what this means is that within the model will reach its target input level of GDP. So usually the models will use the shared socioeconomic pathways, which have, say, 2.6% GDP for the first 10 years. And if there's no climate policy, that will be the level of GDP. But because these are climate models, there is climate policy, which is usually thought of as a carbon tax. And these taxes distort the economy. They force or offset the most productive investments out of the economy and instead replace them with less productive, greener, decarbonizing investments. This lowers the growth potential for the economy and lowers it from that exogenously set path. So at a theoretical level, what's going on here is that the models are assuming that economic activity is set on the supply side of the economy by the overall productive capacity of the economy and not by the demand side. And so in effect, there's no real role for long-term demand effects. And so on the right here, I have a chart from the IPCC's fifth assessment report showing the estimated abatement costs of various scenarios. And you have the different time periods and then the level of warming that's projected going up. And the main takeaway is that by and far, they are all positive. So they're all showing that there will be costs from decarbonization, but also that the costs will be quite large. And see, looking in 2050 or 2100, that you're in a range of 3 to 4 to up to well past 12 degrees or 12% of GDP losses due to decarbonization, which compared with some of the literature on the economic impacts of climate change is a staggering number because of some of the relatively low estimates coming out of that literature. So that there are ways to get around this with equilibrium models. So something that the IEA did in their recent net zero report was to take the investment numbers that came out of the energy side of the model, send them to the IMF to run through their GSE model to then produce short-term economic projections. So what would happen if we actually did these crazy investment plans in the 10-year period? And they found fairly large growth effects. So 0.4 to 0.5 added growth per year, which is quite a large amount when compounded over 10 years. But the issue here is that the projections only run till 2030 and that there's no information on long-term growth. And the reason that they aren't really able to go much further is that based on the type of equilibrium modeling, in the long term, you would expect it to converge back to zero. You would expect it to growth to converge back to the supply constraints.
Sorry, you have 2 minutes. Just
minutes. So I'll go very quickly through macroeconometric modeling just to say that it's another type of modeling that is able to show fairly substantial medium-term growth. And so this is specifically from the Cambridge econometrics model in the RENE renewable energy assessment. And so in particular, they have large demand effects based on a carbon tax that is rebated back to consumers. But the issue with these models as well is that in the much longer term, after about 2050, you have a convergence to the mean. So again, they can be useful for short-term planning, but you do have this issue that if there are these long-term growth effects, if decarbonization is to take place over the next 80 years and not just as a short-term thing, then there's a lot missing from that picture. And so finally, I have to go quickly through this. It's kind of a messy graph, but just what happens if we do allow for these long-term growth effects? So this is from the Medius demand-led system dynamic model, in which there is not this general equilibrium assumption, but rather the economic activity is allowed to be set by the demand side of the economy. And in short, what they find is that in what they call their green growth scenario, the amount of investments that are needed drive a significant amount of extra economic growth over what the input target would have been. But that's an issue within this model because when they add energy limits, and so this is the light green line, you actually have a reduction in economic activity because the energy sector isn't able to keep pace and make new energy investments quickly enough to meet the growth demand that is set in the green growth scenario. So sort of wrapping up here, this all kind of comes to a strange both sides problem, or kind of a for better or worse. Because on one side, if we do have this green growth, mitigating climate change will be economically much easier to finance than our models have suggest. Instead of looking at massive decreases in growth, we could actually be looking at large and permanent boosts to economic growth. But on the other hand, the task of mitigating climate change will actually be larger than we currently expect because of that growth. And so additional investments will be needed to make sure we can cover what's actually unaccounted for in our current models. And so again, what do we as energy modelers do for it? I sort of see two different sides. On the world building side, I think there's a lot of space to experiment with these other types of economic modeling to see what we can do outside of just general equilibrium modeling. But even with the general equilibrium models that we do have, I think there's a lot of room to tell specific stories and tell different scenarios in which it's possible to have these long-term economy-wide rebound effects from the large investments that are being projected by the model itself. Thank you. I hope I got right in on time there. Looking forward to some questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Christopher. Very interesting talk on an important topic, I think. So yeah, happy to open the floor to questions. I think there was the first one in the chat by Daniela from RTD about the question of crowding out effects of the investments, the mitigation ones in energy technology, etc. So yeah, in which models and how are they considered? I mean, yeah, because of course these huge investments could also lead to crowding out effects. So
yeah, and that's exactly the terminology of within these equilibrium models. They assume full crowding out effects. So for every $1 that you would spend on windmills, it's $1 that you're not spending on something else. And so that's how you're able to not have these demand effects. There are other forms of economics or other types of economic theory or models which would not expect full crowding out, even in the long term. And so that's kind of the background that I'm coming from, and thinking that if we have sort of a more Keynesian approach, that there really could be long-term in new investments that do not fully crowd out other investments. And maybe just one last thought on that as well, that I think the actual mechanism by which the transition is done will be quite important here, because if we are actually going to do the transition entirely through carbon taxes, it would be different than if there's large state-led investment projects. And sort of my initial thought would be, if we are doing state-led investments, that would be less likely to be fully crowded out than private investments driven by carbon taxes.
Right. That goes also to the point discussed also a bit this morning about the different policy measures and that they matter also on the macroeconomic level. I think that's an important point to be taken into account. Yeah. Any other questions in the meantime? Please, yeah, you can also write in the chat. Toon, or you can speak here better.
Yeah, sure. I'll ask the question directly. Thank you, Christopher. Very interesting talk indeed on an important topic. Before I start my question, I should probably say I'm a CGE modeler. So it puts me into one of the boxes that you described. And I fully agree that one of the ways to address some of the shortcomings is to go for hybrid modeling, combining energy models with CGE models. And this is one of the things we've been doing as well. Another point for me is to integrate some second best features into your reference. So we have a paper that is coming out soon. That's a topic for a different talk, I think. But yeah, so the idea there is that in your reference, in your baseline, you can build in some imperfections. And in CGE models, what's typically there is initial taxes. Direct, indirect taxes that would imply that's not the optimal. These are already some distortions that are there in the system. Also can include labor frictions and unemployment. And that brings me to the post-Keynesian models. The question I guess I have for you is then, if through these climate policies you can get more investment and greener growth, then the question is, if this is better from a welfare point of view, then why wasn't it happening in the first place? And don't you think it would be important to model explicitly the channels through which initial investment might have been suboptimally low?
I guess I can.
Yeah.
If I respond already. Yeah, no, I think that's sort of trying to take in a couple of different strands there. But the main question of just why the level of investment would have been suboptimal. I guess at a certain point it kind of comes down to fairly deep-lying economic theory questions between neoclassical and post-Keynesian economics. So within post-Keynesian economics, you would not initially assume that the economy is operating at full capacity, and that's sort of the starting baseline, is that except in fairly exceptional times, that is not how modern capitalist economies operate. And there's sort of a number of reasons for that. Some political, some economic. But that's kind of, if that isn't your starting point, then you would then be saying that by doing the energy transition, we are entering an exceptional time, something that closer resembles like a war mobilization than just a normal operation of capitalism. And so in that sense, you would then need to look at the possibility for higher long-term demand there.
Yeah. Okay. Let's maybe move to the talk by Toon actually, so you have the chance to give the speak also for the sake of time, and in case we can speak after. Thanks, Christopher, on a really interesting talk on an important topic. I absolutely agree. So the next speaker is Toon van Dijk from JRC in Sevilla. Yes, I can see your screen.
Can you see it in full screen mode?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so it's a smooth continuation as already some talk about general equilibrium modeling. My name is Toon van Dijk and I work for the European Commission's Joint Research Center. And today I will present a recent assessment of ours on a revision of the minimum energy tax rates in the EU. So this is joint work with my colleagues, also colleagues from different units within the JRC. And the overall context is, of course, the Green Deal. So this is very aptly included in the session that's titled Reaching Our Targets, because as you know, the Green Deal started with setting out higher ambition level for 2030. A bit more than a year ago, the Commission proposed a ratcheting up of the 2030 climate target from 40% to 55% of greenhouse gas emissions below the 1990 levels. And then in the months after that, the European Commission developed a number of policy initiatives that jointly would contribute to reaching this new goal of 55%. So you see them here shown on the slide. So the wide range of initiatives covering vehicles, aviation, maritime. There's land use, there's agriculture, there's also social dimensions, energy dimensions. But what I will be talking about today is the revision of the Energy Taxation Directive. So this fits in the Fit for 55 package that was published on July 14th. So in the summer, the Commission came with a whole package of initiatives, and this always comes with an impact assessment. And this is where we have contributed with the modeling from the JRC side. So perhaps first on quick intro on the Energy Taxation Directive. This is the directive that sets the minimum levels of taxation of excise taxes for energy goods in the EU, across all EU member states. And it originally dates back to the year 2003. So this is already quite old. And already in 2011, there was a proposal to revise the directive, which did not make it politically. And now under the Green Deal, there's been a renewed attempt to revise the directive because some of the elements in there are not very much aligned with the climate targets. So the rates are largely based on volumes of energy products, and not the energy content or the CO2 content. And the scope in terms of the tax base, there's quite a number of exemptions and rate reductions and optional exemptions that are used in very different ways in the different member states. So there's a number of reasons why there is a need to revise the Energy Taxation Directive. So in the impact assessment that came out in July, a number of scenarios were studied, and these were closely designed together with the lead Directorate General of taxation department. So we worked in close collaboration with them to set up the exact scenarios that would be studied under this initiative. And there was a minimalistic policy option that's not shown on the slide here that included a indexation of the minimum rates according to inflation. So that's another issue with the current ETD, is that the minimum rates are not indexed. So over time, this is losing some of its power automatically due to inflation. But then the two bigger reform proposals include a minimum rates that are based on either energy content or on CO2 content. Then there were variations whether we would do a 7-year transition to the new year rates or a 10-year transition. And there was an additional component to account for the damages of different fuels in terms of air pollution and related health problems. So the options with air pollution damages included is the C option, and then A and B is 10-year versus 7-year transition, and energy content versus carbon content is option 2 versus 3. And the charts here are illustrative. There's a couple more of those in the impact assessment annexes, but they show you the philosophy or the concept of raising minimum rates. So the blue rates would be the ones that are already implemented. The orange bars would show a top up under option 2A, and then under option 3A, you see a higher top up as the yellow bar. So you get a more harmonized price signal, but still the ones that have the countries where the tax rates are currently already higher, they remain higher. So in this case, on the bottom left for households, the heating through natural gas. In Denmark, Finland, Netherlands, Sweden, they would see no change actually in this under these scenarios. So what I think was a bit particular about this exercise for us is was the need to really go detailed into the legislation to capture appropriately all the current excise tax rates, including their exemptions and rate reductions, and appropriately capturing not only the rates but also the scope. So there's some out of scope provisions in the energy taxation directive, such as energy used for electrolytic processes. And so for this, to get it right, also the current tax rates in industry, for instance, we work together with our colleagues who went through a detailed processing of energy balances to map it correctly into the economic model. So it was a bit more detailed than, let's say, a global or a EU-wide modeling, an EU-wide carbon price. This made it a bit more challenging, but also makes it more interesting, makes it more closely tied to the actual policy proposal. So these were also closely designed together with the policy DG leading the file, which was also, I think, an added value of this work. Now, a quick overview of the results I show here. In addition to being detailed in terms of capturing the legislation, the assessment also is relatively broad, let's say, covering a number of outputs and indicators. So we use the GEMI3 model. This is our CGE model that we develop and use here in the JRC. And we study the policy scenarios and look at different indicators. So first of all, we have environmental outputs. So we look at CO2 emissions. For this exercise, we actually also looked at air pollution, air pollutant emissions, which was a novelty for the GEMI3 model. So we had to do some model extensions there to follow the policy discussion. As I showed on the previous slide, you have these scenarios with an extra air pollution component. So if you put it in the tax rate, it also makes sense, of course, to study the benefits in terms of air pollutant emissions. Yeah, so we look at different scenarios, emission reductions in different sectors, different countries. We also look at the fiscal implications because the energy taxation, the energy excises, originally they serve also the purpose of raising revenue. And we look at how tax revenue differs across the different scenarios. And you can already see in the baseline or in option 1, which has the indexing of the minimum rates, you see that the excises, the revenue you get from that may be decreasing over time. So this is, of course, in line with decarbonization. You use less fossil fuels, but then also the revenue you get from taxation may decrease. And this is an important element in some of the political discussions. So this is, I think, important to map also the results onto that side. We look also at economic impacts. Here you see GDP losses in the bottom left. So this relates also to the previous presentation, of course. Our hybrid modeling that we typically do, where we connect energy models with the economic model, there we do get, for instance, the extra investments in the power system that lead to additional GDP. Here, and this, or another example would be if we would lower labor taxation, you could also get positive impacts on GDP. Here we look at fairly simple setting in that respect. So we do only the CGE model with no energy system model involved here, and we use the revenue as a lump sum redistribution to the households, and we do not look into other recycling mechanisms. But of course, we could have further discussion about that. Then on the bottom right, you see also an illustration of employment impacts by sector. So you see mainly fossil fuel sectors losing employment, and there can be a shift towards other sectors. So this is all in all an overview of the various types of outputs that we have produced for this impact assessment. And then one element that's also indicated in the title of the presentation are the social aspects. So I have this here on a different slide. By combining our model, the Jimmy 3 model, with the microsimulation model that's operated by our colleagues, this is the Euromod model. We can also look into distributional impacts across different household income groups. And the Euromod microsimulation model is based on household level microdata, the household budget survey for expenditure patterns, and the EU Silk data for the income side. And you see here for the key scenarios, the energy content basis, the carbon content basis, and the carbon plus the air pollution component. You see, first of all, the top row shows a price effect. So you have higher energy prices, and this effect across the household groups is typically regressive. So this indicates that there may be a need to think about compensating mechanisms to offset some of the regressive effects, and we see now also the whole discussion coming with the current spike in energy prices, that this is indeed a very important aspect to consider. Now, if we take into account also the income side effects, which here include the changes in wages and the income from labor, already to some extent the regressive pattern is mitigated, let's say, but you can of course capture income effects in different ways. So there's some uncertainty, I would say, in this channel. But then the last row shows also the potential of the revenue recycling, where here we only recycle the extra tax revenue generated by higher excise taxes on the households, and recycling this tax revenue by giving lump sum transfers to households. So all households get the same sum of money. The revenues are recycled within the member state, and if you do this, you see there is a progressive effect with positive outcomes for the lowest income groups here. So 1 to 10 indicates the income groups for the households. So this is the end of the presentation. Of course, there's a lot more to be looked at in the impact assessment, a lot more charts and explanations. So I welcome you to have a closer look at that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Toon. Thanks a lot. Very, very concise and a relevant policy, and of course part of it, a great analysis. Yeah, we have 2-3 minutes for questions and comments. In the meantime, maybe on the last slide on the social effect, I think that's really great addition to, let's say, a traditional impact assessment. So yeah, I mean, the question, maybe you answered it a bit, but what's in terms of the recycling, so what revenue recycling scheme were you considering? Because that really changed completely the picture. So it's really surprised to see. So did you do any because that's probably not very likely that these additional fiscal values, which are also not so big from what it seems overall, would be redistributed on a lump sum basis. So I don't know if you tried any other recycling schemes to what could be realistic. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks. No, for this exercise we did not, but we are further looking into that. And indeed, it does not seem the most likely recycling option. But however, it shows the potential of this kind of recycling mechanism. So perhaps it would be more realistic to have to imagine some targeted transfers, because the lump sum transfer, you give it to everybody, also the highest income group, and potentially you can recycle not the full amount, but do more targeted recycling to really help those households that are in need, that are facing energy poverty. And yeah, how to best do that? I think that's a good question. So you can think of energy efficiency subsidies for lower income households. You can think of direct income support. You can think also about reducing labor taxes on the bottom side of on the lower income brackets. So there's various recycling options you could think of, but we have so far not done a detailed analysis of those. But would definitely be it's definitely on the wish list.
Great. Okay. Thanks. I think we're gonna let's try have 5 minutes at the very end so we can open most urgent questions. And let's move on to the next talk by Renato Rodriguez from the Potsdam Institute, who is going to talk about alternative roads to mid-century net neutrality in Europe.
Could you allow me to share my screen?
Right.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me well. I had some connection issues at the beginning of the session, so I hope it's better now.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Renato Rodriguez, and I work at PEAK in Germany, in the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And this work is a close collaboration between different researchers from PEAK, the UCL team, and the PRIMES team. And it's basically, I'm going to talk to you today about a multi-model assessment of strategies for achieving climate neutrality in Europe. It's connected to the European Fit for 55 policies, but it's more focused on 2050 goals. So if you want any more details about this, you can access the paper that contains this analysis and was recently published in the Energy Journal. Without further ado, let me start with a bit of the context behind this work. And everybody knows that it's undeniable that the European transformation towards net neutrality can be shaped in different ways. Which are the possible transition pathways that could allow Europe reaching the net neutral economy, and which are the implications of these alternative pathways for the different energy systems that we see in the future, are the main answers, the main questions that we aim to contribute with this work. We aim to underline strategies that are necessary to achieve a decarbonized economy and identifying no regret options in these strategies. So basically, let me describe you briefly the methods that we used in our analysis. And we basically began with the help of a different group of stakeholders to develop future energy system decarbonization narratives. These describe different future worlds that we could achieve a carbon-free future in the energy system. So there are three core narratives of the future that can be underlined by this work. The first one was a narrative of a future where we achieve decarbonization by bridging demand and supply. So basically changes on the demand side of the way energy is consumed play the most important role of this transition. As a result, electrification, renewable technologies, battery electric vehicles, heat pumps achieve high penetration levels in this scenario. And we name it new players and system for this narrative of the future. The second one is focused in supply side transformations, where today's big utilities adapt to remain relevant in the future. Carbon capture and storage, synthetic and bio-based fuels achieved a maturity level, and together with current incumbent technologies, such as, for example, for some countries could be nuclear power plants, they form the basis of the transition for a net neutral future. We named this narrative the incumbents renewal narrative. And finally, the third one was a world with societal engagement and efficient measures, driving the transition to a net neutral world. So lifestyle changes, strong awareness for health and other system effects steers the transition, with reduction in consumption and efficient measures taking the main role. This is the efficiency and sufficiency narrative. So basically in our work, we translate these core narratives into modeling assumptions that reflects the main technical economic characteristics of each one of them. And we use a model comparison exercise with 3 economy-wide energy system models to provide a quantitative analysis of these different decarbonization strategies. Here we use RemindEU, PRIMES, and ETM-UCL models for this purpose. Finally, these strategies were tested into different levels of mitigation for European CO2 mitigation goals. So let's jump into some results of this analysis. So here I'm presenting the remaining carbon budgets that we assume compatible with ambitious climate targets and the European net neutral decarbonization goals by 2050. And the first question is like, under these different future worlds and different strategies for mitigating the CO2 emissions, can we even achieve net neutrality? And from our analysis, it's clear that if there's enough political will to implement the needed measures, yes, we can. Our results show that the European mid-century net neutrality is feasible even under this quite different future energy system that we can have in the future. However, the real question remains is how this net neutrality achieved. So digging deeper on the results that we try to answer this question. So what's better starting point than talking about something that was talked this morning a lot, and it's like the different carbon price levels that are necessary to achieve a climate neutral economy by 2050. In our modern exercise, this effort would correspond to a price increase of up to 30 euros per ton of CO2 per year. We are talking about like in 2050 of prices in the range between 360 and 900 euros per ton of CO2. These prices are very much dependable of the analysis of concurrent supporting policies, standards, technology evolution, societal engagement, and modeling assumptions. So it's true that like most of the emissions reduction options are competitive under lower carbon price levels. However, in order to push the last mile of this getting rid of the remaining CO2 emission, is necessary the presence of either a strong price signal as this one, or strong supporting policies and standards in place, but preferable both together to make it easier the transition and make it possible. So moving on to more fundamental results of our analysis, let's dig into the electrification levels that we see in our scenarios. And here present the electrification share in total final energy from our results. We can see that in all scenarios, electrification increased substantially. Basically, they achieve in 2050 from 2 to 3 times the current levels. So there's a lot of pressure to the electricity system to increase in size. And there is also, this also confirms that like, no matter the scenario that we are evaluating, energy system electrification is a clear no regret decision. So it's something that should be focused without delay. If we took a look at specific sector results, you can take for a residential commercial sector, for example, that can reach up to 80% of electrification total final energy in some scenarios, especially in the new players and systems scenario, which pushes further the dissemination of heat pumps in this sector. This underlines the role of specific sector policies on pushing the electrification boundary limits to allow this decarbonization to happen. Yeah, that's exactly it. So taking a deeper look on how this electricity is even supplied, here I present to you the electricity generation in Europe by technology. It's clear that we need to achieve a significant upscale of renewables. This is even true in scenarios that focus on adapting the incumbent technologies. So this underlines that renewables overtaking is a dominating strategy and therefore another no regrets option to tackle. Nevertheless, like storage and flexibility measures must abide with this ambitious electricity generation reshaping to make this become possible to the future. If we move from the electricity focus and talk about what would be the final energy use on this decarbonized European economy by 2050, here I'm going to present to you the final energy use in the 3 main sectors like transportation, buildings, and industry, to give you a picture of what is this decarbonized world by 2050. You can see how much of these sectors would demand of different energy carriers, for example, liquids, gases, electricity, hydrogen, and so on by 2050 in this chart. Let me try to guide you through some important results here. So you can see in yellow, surely the already mentioned huge contribution of electricity, carbon-free electricity to the emission reductions efforts. Together with direct heat use, red in the charts, and hydrogen in light blue, we can reach a fair share of carbon-free final energy carriers by 2050 in our scenarios. But let's remove those for now and focus our attention on the remaining energy carriers in the economy. The traditional carbonaceous energy carriers, solids, liquids, and gases are presented in color here. And our results show that they will still exist and will be substantially used by 2050. Their demanded quantities will remain about half of today's levels. However, these energy carriers will differ substantially from the liquids and gases we are used to see today. You can see a substantial amount of liquids, for example, still being used in transportation and industry sectors, represented by the dark blue bars in the scenario results. They are necessary due to situations where electrification is uncertain or impractical, such, for example, technical processes that require high energy density or very high temperature heat. We can underline basically like three main alternatives for decarbonizing these energy carriers from our results. The first one is the use of bioenergy. As you already know, bioenergy is a viable alternative to decarbonize the energy system. However, it faces supply challenges, especially in Europe, with limited availability and high land use competition. Besides bioenergy, this limited availability would create space for other energy carriers to contribute to the decarbonization process, such as hydrogen in light blue and e-fuels in the shaded part and in the charts. Hydrogen is especially used in hard to electrify thermal industrial process, and both synthetic fuels and hydrogen can contribute to heavy transportation, aviation, shipping, depending on the scenario. One thing that's clear about these alternatives, their presence is highly dependable of companies supporting policy to push them forward. This is clear in the variation of the results for each of the scenarios that you can see. Even after all of these carbon-free fuel energy carriers are considered, we can still see a need to compensate a certain amount of carbon emitted in final use, as we see in the next and final results that I'm presenting here today. So let's talk a little bit about the emission picture by 2050. First of all, by looking at the net emissions by 2050, we can see that in all scenarios, our results respect the CO2 net neutral goal. However, the important part is like in the left-hand side of this part, where I present the remaining emissions by 2050 and which carbon management options are used to reach their net neutral goal. There's one main important point that I want to underline here, is that all scenarios without exception rely on some level of carbon dioxide removal. Because more technology challenging emission source and hard to abate sectors. Many BECCS in the light blue bar in the chart and direct air capture in the red bars are used for this reason. It is therefore clear that carbon dioxide removal plays an important role for contributing to the last 200 to 600 megatons of CO2 emission reductions under all future strategies. So policy actions today are important to push these to allow offsetting very hard to abate activities and achieve European decarbonization goals. So just to recap our analysis and provide a glimpse of possible conclusions, we talk about three different future and decarbonization strategies. The first scenario was focused on demand side transformation and users embracing new electricity-based technologies like battery electric vehicles and heat pumps. The second one allows end users to continue using energy equipment and infrastructure as they are used to do today. So it's focused on emission neutral fuels, upscale of carbon capture and storage, synthetic bio-based fuels, and nuclear power in specific countries. And the third one targets energy and resource efficiency and focusing deep renovation, lifestyle change, energy savings, circular economy, and shared mobility to achieve the decarbonization. If all the results I present here so far are not clear enough, I must say that we need a lot to make the net neutral goal to become true. But we can definitely say that achieving this goal is feasible under even quite different future energy systems. While the different strategies lead to some differences in technology deployment, we can identify a number of commonalities between all of them. And this yields robust changes that need to be implemented no matter which strategies follow. First, massive expansion of renewables and increased energy efficiency are clear no-regret options. Substantial increasing electrification in all sectors via electric mobility, heat pumps, electrifying industry process will be paramount for the decarbonization. Innovation, development, and diffusion of current immature technologies such as hydrogen, synthetic fuels, carbon capture storage, utilization, and carbon dioxide removal is required to decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors. In conclusion, there's a current need for policy action now to develop these capabilities for the near future. Just one more source of information. The results that I present here today are only scratching the surface of the results that information that we created on the InnoPaths projects. And we developed a specific tool to allow people to assess and do further analysis in the results that we did on this work. This tool is named Low Carbon Pathways Platform, and you can access it today if you want under the web page in the screen. And you are going to able to access all the results that I present here today and more, like for example, country level specific results directly to the website. So sorry for taking a little bit longer, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Renato. Thanks a lot. Yeah, we have just, I think, 1 minute for a quick question. There's already one by Toon who is asking, yeah, what about, I mean, these interesting different narratives, what were, let's say, the main challenges in translating those into the models, which maybe there's some insights on your experience.
Yeah, definitely. This is like a very key point in the work that was carried. So basically, like in the paper, you can find more details about it. So basically, like what we did is like each narrative only draws the scenario of the end decarbonized system. And what we did was to identify which kind of changes would happen to allow that future to become possible. These were translated then in technical economic characteristics. For example, like which kind of like policy push is necessary to achieve this world with like high penetration of electric vehicles, or this world where like you have enough carbon-free fuels, synthetic fuels to allow the future to happen. So you can find a little bit more details in the paper, and you can also like just talk directly to me and I can give you like the details. But it's like it's a huge challenge in two ways. Like we cannot represent all policies in this kind of models. It's very, very challenging to represent some of them. So we need to like have a compromise between how much can we do. And we use a lot of like also back of envelope calculations to feed up information to these models of how these transitions could happen. The biggest challenge is like the speed of the transition actually. Is like how fast can you actually turn a technology to like a widespread technology, something like that. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, I think great. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Renato. Okay, so let's move to our last presentation for today, which is by Gunhild. On again EU carbon neutrality and looking a bit more focusing on renewables. So we can already see your screen. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So if everything is okay on the technical side, I'll do my best to guide you through the last 15 minutes or so of this session. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gunhild Reigstad, and I'm working at SINTEF Energy Research. And today I will focus on the difference that we observed in cost-optimized transition pathways to carbon neutrality by 2050, and that stems from increased targets for renewable energy consumption. And I will have a specific focus on the power and the hydrogen sectors, and I'll try to show how these sectors are strongly affected by these increased targets for renewables. So this presentation is based upon the work that we did in the Hydrogen for EU study, and so I would like to acknowledge as well that I'm a part of a big team with my co-authors listed on the slide here, both from SINTEF and also from IFP Energy Nouvelle. and at Deloitte that held the project management. Let me see. Okay, there we go. So then I hope you can see my next slide. I thought before I would dive into the results themselves that I would like to share a few words about the study. The Hydrogen for EU study is an industry-driven study. So you can see that in addition to Deloitte, IFPN, and SINTEF that carried out the work, we also had a funding body with all the companies that you can see on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you can see the 27 countries that we included in the study, that also included the 3 non-EU countries, Norway, UK, and Switzerland. We applied in this study 3 different models to capture the different nuances that we think are important for the transition towards carbon neutrality in 2050. So first of all, if we move from the left-hand side, we wanted to include details of geography and as well technologies. And so to this end, we used a detailed energy system model that is based upon linear programming. Then we also wanted to capture the so-called learning by doing effects that are cost reductions that stems from learning and is a function of accumulated investments in certain technologies. And we believe that these effects are important for quite a few of the technologies that we rely on for decarbonization of the energy system. So we applied a learning optimization model that is based upon a dynamic programming. And then we also have a third model to calculate the cost of bringing in hydrogen from outside of the considered region, as you can see on the right-hand side here, so from Russia, Middle East, and North Africa. So a little bit about the framework that we set for the scenarios. Today, I will present results from 2 different pathways. And the left-hand side of the figure here basically shows you that the set targets for CO2 emissions are equal for the 2 scenarios that we consider. So we have a 55% reduction to 2030 and a net zero target for 2050. We also have the current energy efficiency targets implemented and the more general current policy framework within Europe. On the right-hand side, you can see what is giving the main difference between these 2 scenarios. So the blue line here belongs to the scenario that is called technology diversification, and it contains the current target for share of renewable energy in the final gross energy consumption of 32.5%. And we can see, as has been mentioned as well before today, that this share actually also increases towards 2050 due to the set CO2 emission targets. If we look at the green line, this belongs to the scenario that's called renewable push scenario. And we can see that here we have set targets for the share of renewable energy for 2040 and 2050, in addition to the 2030 target, and we have also elevated the 2030 target to 40%. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, we see a growth in renewables in this first scenario, so the technology diversification pathway with the current set target for renewables, but with increased targets for CO2 emission reductions. So on the left-hand side here, you can see the investments. So the dark green here is the 2016 renewable energy supply, and then the light green is the addition that we see coming towards 2050. So the total length of the bar here is the 2050 energy supply. And so what you can see is that the large contribution comes from wind energy, but we also have significant contributions from solar and as well additions from bioenergy. So if we then look about what is the main difference between this scenario and the renewable push scenario, where we have increased targets for renewable shares, we see that the main difference stems from energy supply, from wind and solar energy. And these are the main kind of contributors as you raise the demands for renewables in the gross final energy consumption. So the wind and the solar of the energy supply side that we saw on the previous slide is also then naturally reflected when we look at power production. So on this slide, I show the power production from wind on the left-hand side and from solar on the right-hand side. And it shows the total power production for each investment period. And then, so we have this technology diversification at the bottom here, and then the dark blue for the wind here is the addition that comes on top. So it is the difference between the renewable push scenario with increased targets for renewables and the technology diversification scenarios. And so we can see that for power production in the 2030 investment period, there is there is a small difference between the renewable push and the technology diversification scenarios, but then this difference grows as we approach 2050. If we look at the solar power production, we see that there is a more significant difference between the two scenarios already in 2030, but that the difference kind of in absolute terms remains more constant towards 2050. So it will be natural to kind of expect to see increased final electricity consumption in the renewable push scenario, since we have larger power production in this scenario. But actually what we observe is that the final electricity consumption is of the more or less the same kind of magnitude between the two scenarios. So what we do see is that the hydrogen market and the hydrogen production routes into the hydrogen market is significantly affected. So on the right-hand side here, I've presented the electricity consumption that goes into electrolyzers to produce hydrogen. And so what we can see is that for the technology diversification scenario, we reach quite high electricity consumption rates, but we also see that in the renewable push scenario, the consumption is almost twice as high when we reach 2050. So what we see then is that the increased power production that comes with the increased renewable targets then is directly reflected into how hydrogen is produced. So if we look on the overall level of the hydrogen market in itself and how it kind of evolves, we see that the absolute size of the hydrogen market is quite similar for these two scenarios. A little bit higher for the renewable push scenario, but not very much larger. So the main difference stems from the balance between hydrogen from electricity through electrolyzers and as well the hydrogen from natural gas with CCS that we have more of in the technology diversification scenario. So I thought in the end, I liked the expression of the presenter before me that said we need a lot of investments in everything that can, and I guess we can add, that takes us to carbon neutrality and decarbonization. And I would like to strongly as well emphasize the same kind of message. So I brought with me this final slide where I wanted to take a little bit of a look into the scale-up demands for both electrolyzer capacities and long-term CO2 storage. And these are meant as examples. I mean, you could show the same kind of pictures for solar and wind and the other technologies that we need as well, carbon dioxide removal technologies and so forth. So on the left-hand side here, I have the investments and the capacities that we need for electrolyzers in these two scenarios. So for 2030, in the technology diversification scenario, we have an invested capacity of 20 gigawatts, which is half of the EU targets set for this time period. But we see that towards 2050, we reach more or less 700 gigawatts of electrolyzers, which is a significant scale up. And we see as well for the renewable push scenario, we reach 1,400 gigawatts. So this is a significant scale up for electrolyzers. And on the right-hand side, we have the annual injection capacity of CO2 to permanent storage. And we see that we have as well here quite high demands for both scenarios. A little bit higher for the technology diversification scenario. And this is to some degree explained by the hydrogen production routes, that we have more hydrogen from natural gas here. That also leads to higher demands for storage capacity. But nevertheless, for the renewable push scenario here, we have 1,200 megatons of CO2 being stored each year almost. And already for the 2030 period, we have 400 megatons of CO2 being stored per year. And the current company plants are at around 50 megatons of CO2 stored each year. So with that, I think I will end here, and we will have a couple of minutes left before we end the session. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, and indeed, yeah, we have a few minutes left. Thanks a lot. Okay, great. So let me know if there's any particular question on to Gunhild, maybe on this presentation and the two different scenarios. In case, also write it on the chat. We can then also, I mean, there's the coffee break is coming soon, so I don't want to eat into that, but I think, yeah, thanks first of all the speakers. I think there's a lot of interesting questions to be asked. Unfortunately, the online format is not always making it easy. I think we saw a lot of great detail on model development, linking and coupling, combining models to assess both scientific and policy relevant questions. So that's really great to see at the EMP-E here. Yeah, any final comments or questions from the audience or the speakers? I think, well, I mean, there will also be, I mean, apart from the recording, be a little summary on all the presentations. So the idea is to make it really available to most people. We already saw a lot of papers already and links that I also tried to collect of all the works that has been presented. So that's that other people who didn't manage maybe because of the time to join today can also access it. Yeah, I mean, with that being said, well, thanks really a lot for everyone taking the time to present here his or her work. I think we've seen a lot of really ambitious work taking up the policy push by the Fit for 55 package to see what it implies for the future based on our models and all the approaches that are scientifically out there. So yeah, as you know, there will be skill workshops in half an hour, I think. So we have a half an hour of coffee break now, and then we reconvene, I think, tomorrow. Yeah. So let me just take this chance to finally give a big hands up and thank you to everyone, and hope to see you soon, probably, or after at 4 at the skills workshop, and if not, tomorrow morning. Okay, well, thanks everyone.
Thanks
Enjoy
a lot,
your
Johannes.
coffee, and see you soon.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. See you. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.